We're back for another episode of, a conversation, we'll call it, about stress. Because last time I spoke with Olivia, we got into the cortisol conversation. We didn't quite get to finish it because Zoom cut us off. So, Olivia, I want to talk a little bit more about stress because I think it's something that everybody thinks about, and maybe has some misconceptions about too. The main thing I think you were honing in on about stress was how cortisol is not necessarily always a bad thing, but we didn't get really into the weeds about why.
Mhm.
So give us a recap on what cortisol is, what it isn't, and
Mhm.
some ways that you see maybe in your practice it functions as both a negative and a positive thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So cortisol, again, like as you said, it does get a bad rap. And I mean, it's true, there's more cases or more often than not, people do have high levels of cortisol just in
Right.
our modern world. There's so much stress and stimulation and overwhelm. And so it's very easy for people to have like too much cortisol output from their adrenals.
Right.
But yeah, like you had said, and I had mentioned last week, cortisol is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, obviously, it serves some physiological, biological function. Um, and I guess just like high level, just to give a little bit of background on cortisol and like what it is and what it does before we get into the nuances. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and it's released from our adrenals. So all of us have these adrenal glands that sit on top of our kidneys, and these adrenal glands control electrolytes and fluid balance. They control cortisol output, other stress hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, DHEA, which is like a master hormone, is also produced from our adrenals mostly, and DHEA then gets converted into testosterone. So our adrenals are very, very, very important. And this is where cortisol is created or released, I should say. And so if we're to, well, I should say cortisol is very like circadian in nature. And
Mm.
so it follows like a very specific pattern throughout a 24-hour period. And so it's supposed to be at its lowest point in the evening. And that's because it's like energizing. It gives us energy. It's like what gets us out of bed in the morning. It helps with motivation. It gives us energy. Um, and actually, the main reason why, if we're thinking about it on like again a physiological level, cortisol actually mobilizes glucose, blood sugar, out of our liver via a process called gluconeogenesis.
Right. What
And
was talked about
so,
last week, right?
yeah, yeah. And so there's like an evolutionary like adaptation. Like our bodies have evolved intentionally in that way. If we're stressed, I mean, glucose really is what it's like energy for our cells, essentially. We need glucose for ATP production. And so cortisol is kind of like the impetus for all of that. Not always, but when cortisol is high, then it helps to like produce more glucose or allows for more glucose output in our um, and so again, if we're to look at like our cortisol over a 24-hour period, when we wake up, it's still kind of in like a low state. It's not super high, but then within 60 minutes of waking up, we have our cortisol awakening response, and it's supposed to be actually at its highest point at that time. So within 60 minutes of waking up, our cortisol jumps all the way up, and that's if we're looking at a 24-hour graph, like of our cortisol, it's supposed to be at its highest point at that time. Um,
I wonder too, because and I'm sure people with wearables can relate. I have an Aura ring. I
mhm.
notice in the morning that wearables pick up a spike in heart rate when you wake up. Does that correspond with like a spike in heart rate typically, or does that depend on the person? Do you know if there's any sort of correlation there?
Yeah, it likely does depend on the person. To be quite honest, I mean, actually, yeah, that would make sense.
Okay.
Our cortisol is likely the culprit behind why your heart rate might increase in the morning.
Right. And this 24-hour cycle, I know when we were talking about reproductive hormones last week, we mentioned that. women and men have different reproductive hormone cycles, but this 24-hour cycle off of for cortisol is for both men and women.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, that difference really, I mean, there's so many differences physiologically and genetically and in many other ways with men and women, but with cortisol, it's consistent with both genders.
Right.
So, so again, cortisol spikes first thing in the morning, and that's in theory, that's what's supposed to help like get us motivated, get us ready for the day, give us energy, and that's why you've probably heard Andrew Huberman and like tons of other people now. The circadian science is like really, really big right now, and they say get sunshine first thing in the morning when you
Yeah.
wake up. And the reason for that is because we actually have cells. They're called melanopsin cells, and they're within our retina, and they register sunlight, like the UV light first thing in the morning. That actually helps to trigger cortisol production,
Hmm.
which is good for our circadian rhythm. It also helps with like the production of dopamine and serotonin, which is great. I mean, there's a lot of validity to getting sunshine in your eyes first thing in the morning. Of course, not direct, like looking directly at the sun, but getting outside and having some of that sunshine exposure. Um, and then again, so we have that peak in the morning, and then cortisol comes down. Like there's a pretty steep curve, and it comes down into the evening, and it's supposed to be at its lowest point like when we're ready for bed. And cortisol, also fun fact, has like an inverse relationship with melatonin.
Hmm.
And so as we see like the cortisol curve come down into the evening, we're supposed to have an increase in melatonin at that time. Melatonin obviously is like most people know of it as being the sleep hormone. It has many, many functions in our body. It even serves as an antioxidant. But yeah, one of its main purposes is to help us get into a deep sleep.
I'm curious to pick your brain as the functional nutritionist in the room, how the food and or liquids we have in the morning
Mm,
affect cortisol, because that's also something I hear Andrew Huberman talk about a lot is,
yeah.
well, delay your coffee intake 90 minutes. I'm not perfect with that, by the way. I feel like I try to do it every day and I can't always do the 90 minutes. Sometimes I do 60, sometimes I do 30.
Yeah.
Um,
hmm
what's your take on ingesting food at certain times in the morning? Is there an easy way to kind of gamify the cortisol response from food, or is that, like you said, highly dependent on the person? Or is there something
Yeah.
constant across the board with food intake in the morning?
Yeah, no, for sure. There's definitely ways to biohack your cortisol first thing in the morning. I haven't been able to find a whole lot of literature on like the 90-minute thing.
Same.
Maybe I'm not looking in the right places, but I haven't been able to find so much like validity
Right.
or literature on that. But there's definitely something to be said about what you consume in the morning, especially before you have coffee, and especially because there's such an intimate link between cortisol and glucose, as I mentioned, one influences the other in a very intimate way. And so if we're eating, for example, like high sugar, high, processed cereals or pastas, like something that is going to negatively influence our blood sugar, that's also going to negatively influence our cortisol as well.
Oh,
Coffee, as we know too, caffeine for the most part does trigger like a cortisol response. So it triggers the release of cortisol from our adrenal glands. And if we're consuming coffee on an empty stomach and it's kind of like hitting our adrenals first thing, without having any blood sugar balancing or blood sugar stabilizing food in our system, like protein or fat, that can definitely contribute to like blood sugar imbalances, and having like erratic blood sugar throughout the day.
right.
There's also like aside from the cortisol connection, there's a lot of research, and of course, I've mentioned this connection between cortisol and glucose and insulin, but so we know there is a connection for sure, but there's a lot of research on how what you eat first thing in the morning actually can set you up for success throughout the rest of the day in terms of blood sugar. Like
Yeah.
if you're having at least 30 grams of protein first thing in the morning, you're gonna have a better time like stabilizing your blood sugar throughout the day. You're gonna be more sensitive to insulin. Insulin is the hormone that acts as like a key to unlock your cellular door to allow glucose in to be utilized as energy. And so, yeah, there's a lot of research and again, validity on the fact that if we have protein and fat first thing in the morning, we're going to be more sensitive to insulin for the remainder of the day and just have a better chance to stabilize our blood sugar.
We left a macronutrient out there, carbs, which I think a lot of people have differing opinions on, like, oh, I can't have too many carbs in the morning.
Mhm.
How about carbs? Where do carbs fit in there? Does that decrease the sensitivity to insulin, or is it the inverse? How do carbs interact with it?
Yeah. So carbohydrates actually help with for the most part, of course, there's such a difference. Like I feel like carbohydrates, it's such like a broad term because there's
Yeah,
so many different kinds.
right.
Well, not so many different kinds, but we have like the good carbohydrates and the
Yeah.
bad carbohydrates. So
Okay.
to directly answer your question, if we're having, a full breakfast first thing in the morning, ideally, yeah, we want some carbohydrates, but from whole foods.
Right.
So like fruit would be ideal. If like I always encourage people to try to get greens first thing in the morning, maybe from like a smoothie or making them with eggs or something.
Mm.
Um, like a complex carbohydrate or like a carbohydrate that's rich in like resistant starch or soluble fiber
Mm.
could be good too. So think like sweet potato or black beans or plantain, something like that. But I always, again, just thinking of the circadian nature of our hormones and our cortisol and glucose and insulin, it's actually better to have more carbohydrates in the evening because in theory, they actually help to decrease cortisol. Um, yeah, so it's better to have more carbohydrates in the evening
Right.
to help with cortisol decrease as you're like getting ready for bed.
I noticed you left like the very wheat-based fibrous carbs like bagels, bread, and toast out of are those necessarily negatives from a carbohydrate standpoint, or are they
Yeah.
negatively impacting in the morning versus midday or evening?
Yeah. Yeah, I know I hate to like label food as good or bad, but um it's really like truly personal. I am not a huge I mean, again, it's for the most part, yes, we don't want to have refined carbohydrates, ideally ever.
Right. Yeah.
But like, yeah, first thing in the morning, they can negatively impact, especially if you're having them alone. You
Yeah.
know, if you're having protein and fat with like a whole wheat bagel or an everything bagel, that's going to be a lot better metabolically than just having a bagel with cream cheese.
Yeah.
Um, but you mentioned wheat. Yeah, I mean, that is like a very personalized thing. Some people are more just like genetically sensitive to gluten, which can be determined through blood tests or stool testing. I do say, even with my clients that don't have like any antibodies to gliadin or gluten, um, I still tell them, like, look, the way that wheat is processed and harvested in this country is like unfortunately not great.
Right.
It's typically sprayed with a lot of pesticides and glyphosate in particular, which can be really, really toxic and harmful for our system. So I don't encourage people to go crazy and eat a ton of pasta and bagels and breads, although it's fun and can be fine in moderation, but it's not something I recommend to do like liberally.
Yeah.
But yeah, first thing in the morning, again, it's not necessarily bad, but I would prefer somebody just for the sake of like metabolic enhancement. I would prefer them to have some protein, some fat with a bagel or whatever carbohydrate.
I do want to use the second half of our conversation to pivot to the gluconeogenesis and the glucose and insulin piece. But before we do that, I've also curious of your take on this. It might kind of fall under the same literature lacking realm as the the caffeine delay piece. But
Mm, mm,
oftentimes I've heard from not from Huberman as well, but also other we'll call them health influencers that having electrolytes before
mm,
coffee can actually null the cortisol effect and have kind of like a counteractive adenosine receptor effect.
mm.
What's your take on that? Do you notice that if somebody were to have like an electrolyte drink before their at first thing in the morning, that could also improve insulin sensitivity and have these same downstream effects, or not quite?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I wouldn't say that they necessarily, like electrolytes necessarily null the cortisol spike that we
Mm,
would see from having coffee.
okay.
But as I mentioned previously, like our adrenals are also responsible, in addition to like cortisol balance, they're also responsible for fluid balance, which includes electrolytes,
Yeah.
magnesium, calcium, potassium. So there's definitely a connection there with electrolytes and cortisol.
Okay.
Um, What's fascinating about this is like the biggest thing is going to be the fact that yeah, we need cortisol first thing in the morning. Electrolytes are always important. I could talk about water and fluid intake like all day. I took a whole course on it, actually, like a CE course, and there's so much to say about it. There's actually
Yeah.
so much on water, but for the sake of this conversation, I'll leave it at this. Um, so sodium, like high quality sodium, actually helps to like keep cortisol in your blood. It like helps to like it helps cortisol stick in your blood. And so if we're drinking electrolytes first thing in the morning, that is going to help with cortisol balance in a way, just in the sense that it's going to help with like keeping your cortisol high as it's supposed to be first thing in the morning. So does it null the effects of like the caffeine impact, the impact that caffeine has on cortisol first thing in the morning? Not necessarily, but it's still good to have electrolytes first thing in the morning, especially high quality sodium. Like Element, I'm a huge fan of Element, or um, what's the other brand? Like the flower of the ocean. What? Oh, Celtic sea salt. I was
Oh, okay.
blanking.
I haven't heard of that one,
Redmond.
so I have to check them
Yeah,
out. Oh, Redmond's I've heard of. Yeah.
Redmond's is good. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Celtic sea salt though. It's one of my favorites.
Not
Um,
sponsored by them, by the way, just so we
no,
know. So
no, I
she's not
should be.
she's not benefiting off this, everyone. But good to know for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, great. I think that's super helpful. You gave us a really good kind of breakfast rubric with, coffee and, what you might have after coffee and things like that to stimulate this gluconeogenesis, which is essentially the liver's and kidneys' ways of giving us energy, right? So
Hmm.
talk a little bit more about cortisol and gluconeogenesis in the sense that I would want to know after breakfast, after waking up, let's say I'm being a little bit more conscious of my cortisol. Of course, the average everyday listener to this podcast, if you will, is not probably going to think about cortisol every single day. But
Hmm.
let's try to give people a good routine maybe to follow to
Hmm.
kind of stimulate better gluconeogenesis. What would somebody do after having a, let's say, 30 grams of protein breakfast with a little
Hmm.
carbohydrates and fat and their coffee? How would they go about keeping cortisol at that nice kind of peak and trough level throughout the day
Hmm.
after
Hmm.
breakfast?
Yeah. So ideally, after breakfast or after that like peak in the morning, we actually want cortisol to go down. We want it to start trending downward.
Right.
So I would say the optimal morning, afternoon into the evening routine to optimize cortisol, and blood sugar, of course. And just to touch on that, I mean, this gluconeogenesis process is really relevant when when we're in a state of stress, for example. If you think about like how humans have evolved, when there was like a famine or we had gone long periods without food, cortisol, that's a stressful situation. And so cortisol is then released from our adrenals. And again, it's more of like like a protective mechanism where then cortisol is like shuttled into the liver and stimulates the production or the release of glucose via that gluconeogenesis process.
Right.
But just to again touch on like the optimal morning routine or like into the afternoon evening routine, I would say yeah, first thing getting some electrolytes with your first glass of water, and then having some like protein, some fat. Um, Also getting outside can be really helpful too for stimulating like yeah, of course, dopamine, serotonin production, cortisol balance. It can also be helpful for energy too. But then having a protein-rich breakfast, ideally like 30 grams of protein, like you mentioned, would be ideal. So something like You could do eggs. I'm a huge fan of like tempeh as well. We could do smoothies with protein powder. We could do like salmon is really good with avocado, and then having your coffee to sort
Okay.
of balance out the cortisol, the impact that caffeine has on cortisol.
Right.
The fat and the protein really helps to like stabilize that. It's not going to like boost your blood sugar.
Yep.
Um, and then throughout the rest of the day, I recommend trying not to get too stressed out.
Yes. Yeah. Easy enough.
You know,
Easy enough advice, I feel like.
yeah, it's also easier said than done, of
Yeah.
course, but
Sure.
I oftentimes recommend too, again, just keeping in mind like the circadian rhythm, trying to get outside during the day if you can. Most of us are like inside and we don't have a lot of exposure to like the UV light or the high lux light, which is really, really important for circadian balance. And so trying to get outside, if somebody is like, oh, I'm really tired in the afternoon or after lunch, I'm like, get outside and take a walk. That should be helpful.
Yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, trying to keep stress low or trying to manage your, you know, stress in general, manage perspectives. All of that can be really helpful to make sure we're maintaining that like downward curve with cortisol as we're supposed to see versus like ups and downs.
I'm curious as to your thoughts about food timing. I think people that I follow who are much less experienced than yourself have very strong opinions on the time of days that people need times of
Mm,
day that people need to eat.
mm,
I'm curious if you feel this way. I tend to think that that gets a little too into the weeds, and that I think it's not worth people obsessing over a strict eating time every day. However, I guess this is a two-pronged question. I'd love to know your thoughts first on food timing, but I'd also
mm,
like to know if food timing does matter in some respects for, and if gluconeogenesis has an impact on that glucose drop that typically happens around, like, is it 2 or 3 p.m. in the day where you kind of get
mm,
that, like, that drop where you just lose energy? I
mm,
think that happens to a lot of people. First,
mm.
does food timing matter? And second, if it does matter, is does it have any impact? And is that a cortisol thing too? With that kind of
Mhm,
midday lull that everybody feels around 2,
mm.
4 p.m.?
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, not to answer your question with another question, but I'm curious what people are saying in terms of food timing because it can be relevant for certain things,
Yeah,
like gut health or, yeah, circadian rhythm. There's definitely some relevancy in terms of meal timing, but
yeah.
I'm curious, like, if you have any like specific like fasting or I'm curious to hear what these influencers are are
I think
recommending, I guess.
I think fasting has a large influence on the cycles that these people are pushing. I
Yeah.
think whether or not they want to admit it, it kind of does kind of fall within that 8 to 16 window. A lot
Mm,
of what I see, to give you some context, is kind of like, oh, late breakfast, like 2 hours after you wake up, where you're eating
uh,
around, like, let's say you wake up at 8, eat your breakfast at 10
mm,
and fast until then, or drink water
mm,
until then, right? Midday lunch, no later than 2 p.m. because you don't
mm,
want to, have a late dinner. And some people say eat dinner as early as 6 p.m., which I think is just unrealistic for some
so
people.
much noise.
Yeah, like,
Crazy.
I know for sure I can't eat dinner at 6 p.m. every day. It rarely happens that
Mm,
way. And here's the thing. I get that having a late dinner is not conducive to a good night of sleep or circadian rhythm, but like,
mm,
I don't think it needs to be so rigid as to have the times of day nailed down to the hour. And
mm.
that's kind of what I hear, is like having a strict,
Yeah.
repeatable day, that which is just not realistic for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so much like noise with nutrition science and with functional medicine and all of these like personalized recommendations because the reality is like the research for most of these things is mixed. I mean, our bodies are so physiologically complex, and there's such a difference between men and women, and it just like nutrition science gets so nuanced.
Mm.
But if we're thinking about the science that exists on like the circadian rhythm, we're talking about cortisol. Again, cortisol is very circadian in nature. It follows a very specific, or it should follow a very specific pattern throughout a 24-hour period. But if we're looking again at like the circadian research, Meal timing does matter, but
Hmm.
probably not in the way that you're hearing these influencers say.
Right.
There's a researcher, his name is Dr. Sachin Panda. I think his lab is in San Diego, and he's like one of, in addition to Huberman, he's one of like the leading researchers on the circadian rhythm and circadian science. And what he found in his lab with like decades of research was that actually having your biggest meal within an hour of waking up is like the most ideal for metabolic function,
Wow.
for circadian enhancement. And then he says, like having a smaller meal with lunch a couple hours later, and then having like a medium-sized meal 3 to 4 hours before you're ready to go to sleep.
Right.
There is also some validity to maintaining like the same meal time every day.
Okay.
The more that our body is in routine, the more that we can maintain waking up at the same time every day, the more we can maintain going to sleep at the same time every day. And this is so hard for so many people, of course, but this is just what the science says.
Right.
If we can maintain like eating around the same time every day, every single one of our meals, then the better we're going to be in terms of like cortisol output, glucose balance, blood sugar balance, and insulin too. And so there is definitely some validity to that. And then we also have to think about gut health
Yeah.
as well. I mean, our gut is also very circadian in nature. There's genes in our gut that actually turn on and off.
Mm.
Like once it hits like a certain time of the day, this is from Dr. Sachin Panda, what he found in his research in his lab is that there's genes in our gut that like turn off in the evening. So like our gut is like actually not functioning, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we think about like meal timing for gut health, it is optimal to maintain at least like 3 to 4 hours in between meals just to optimize this process called the migrating motor complex,
Mm.
which is basically like the movements that your gut takes to help sweep like food and bacteria and things like from the stomach into the intestines. It's better to leave again like 3 to 4 hours in between meals, and then also like maintaining like not eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to sleep too. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of different ways in which this could be relevant. But yeah, there's definitely some validity to meal timing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I love it. I feel like really focused episode here because we got like a lot of like knowledge bombs. I feel like we've had a few on the previous episodes, but there's like quite a few that I feel like, oh, like there's some really good footnotes
Yeah.
from this episode for sure.
Hmm.
I want to go back to that with these last few minutes here, that kind of midday drop in energy that some
Oh
people
yeah.
experience. What would you attribute that to? Is that cortisol related?
Mm.
There are ways to counteract it? And would you call that maybe a flaw in some people's circadian rhythm, or is it just natural? It's
Mm.
bound to happen to some.
Yeah. I think in some regard it might be a flaw in like our culture.
Oh,
Um, the fact that we are expected to like go, go, go all day long. In a lot of cultures they do, there is this like built-in time where people are resting during that part of the day.
siesta.
Um,
I mean, yeah.
yeah. And if you look at again, like I'm picturing of all the like cortisol tests that I've done, yeah, around 2 to 3 p.m. is when we hit that sort of like that low point. Of course, it's cortisol is supposed to get lower and lower as the day goes on, but like, yeah, after that morning spike, we continue to see a downward trend, and yeah, some people might experience this fatigue or this level of like, you know, not feeling motivated or whatever. Brain fog is oftentimes what I hear around that time. I mean, yeah, that definitely could be due to the cortisol dip, but I also think it's multifactorial too. If somebody is not eating like a healthy lunch, or they've been like go go go, they haven't really left any time for a break or for walks, or they've had tons of caffeine in the morning, they might experience a crash at that time. So again, could be multifactorial, but definitely yes, I think there is a lot of validity to the fact that like our cortisol is decreasing, and it's does get lower at that point compared to what it was a couple hours like earlier previous. So yeah, again, I think it's probably more of a flaw in our culture, the fact
Makes a
that we're
lot of
expected to
sense.
push through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it from a cultural standpoint too. I do think in some ways culture has adapted to that in the way in
Yeah.
which, kids mostly finish school around that time of day
Mm-hmm.
and their day is done. I think
Mm-hmm.
it is, still a flaw in our culture that kids are expected to do as much homework as they have to do because I can imagine, I just remember being a student in school and finish the
Mm-hmm.
school day. And if I didn't have practice, I'd go home and it's just like, all right, I'm done with work for the day. And doing homework
Yeah.
felt like a huge task after that. So,
Yeah.
but you see it in the workplace too. I think like there's that
Yeah.
feeling of wanting to check out at 3 p.m. So yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's really interesting because um, Dr. Sachin Panda, this circadian researcher, he also in his book, The Circadian Code, he talks about how we are like there's like motivation wanes, like ebbs and flows throughout the day, and like we have most of our like brain power, or we can get most of our work done and be the most efficient and theoretically like feel the most motivated in the earlier hours of the day. And if we also look at like indigenous cultures that lived very closely like with nature and were very in tune with like the natural rhythms of like our human bodies, like they also only worked 5 hours a day, 4 or 5 hours a day,
Mhm. Yeah.
And so yeah, I think there's a lot of again validity to that. Maybe just naturally, biologically, we're not supposed to be working until 5, 6, 7 every day.
Right. Well, that's great. Big takeaways from this episode. I'd say cortisol is not necessarily your enemy. It's actually good to have cortisol early in the day, as long as it's going down
Yeah.
later in the day, followed by a protein-rich breakfast and a healthy
Mhm.
lunch, and ideally a not too big dinner. And that meal schedules kind of matter in some respect, but don't overthink it. Don't stress about it, right? If you're stressed,
Yeah.
that's just not going to be good for cortisol.
Mhm.
What else with these last few minutes should we say about cortisol to kind of give
Yeah.
people some knowledge to depart with?
Yeah. I think one thing I see a lot in practice is like that we didn't get to touch on, and maybe we save this for our
Next
next
episode. Yeah.
conversation, but burnout.
Mm,
Burnout is huge. And that's when, like, when I'm thinking about labs or how that manifests in like lab work is we see like a flat line, a cortisol flat line.
mm,
Like, no, there's no spike as there should be in the morning.
right.
And that can typically come from having like prolonged periods of stress and
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
We see that a lot in people who have PTSD or a lot of like trauma in their early childhood or like during their most formative years.
Yeah.
And that's also very, very relevant. And I see it very often. And that can lead to fatigue. It can lead to depression. It can lead to chronic pain. There's
Yeah.
a lot of herbs that can be really good for boosting cortisol and helping with burnout. Um, but that's something that's very relevant too that I see very often. So again, maybe we talk about that next time a little bit.
That's a great way to tee up next episode. I love it. Well, yes, so definitely look forward to that, talking a little bit more about burnout. The trauma piece is interesting. I'm curious to
Oh
see
yeah.
how what you've seen in your practice, and I'd also want to spend a little time next episode talking about what kind of lab indicators to look for along with
Yeah.
low cortisol reading too.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I've been really interested in trauma research recently. I'm reading a book right now by Gabor Mate. I don't know if you know who that is. He's
yeah,
very like famous and popular, but
yep,
it's fascinating. It's so, so fascinating the impacts that trauma can have on us physically in
right.
adulthood.
Mhm.
It's seen more often in women, definitely in men as well, but
Sure.
it's just fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to maybe, I'm no expert by any means, but I would love to maybe talk about that as well at some point.
Yeah. Hey, my goal for this newsletter is not to really be an expert in any one thing and try to explore a little bit of everything. So I would love to.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for this, Olivia. Guys,
Yeah.
we'll see you next week on the next conversation.